Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of the Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael the Fighting Scott Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. And I appreciate the shout out to my old high school. As a business and healthcare law firm, we meet a lot of interesting people and learn their amazing stories. In today's episode, we're going to talk with one of my closest childhood friends, Robin Pou. Brad and I have a long professional history with Robin, and Robin has had a major impact on where we are today and has a ton of fresh insight.
Yeah, and Michael, when we were preparing for this episode with Robin, you and I had a little sidebar and started talking about the classic golf movie Tin Cup.
Yes. Kevin Costner as Roy McAvoy, Cheech Marin, Rene Russo, and Don Johnson.
Yeah, so it's and there's lots of great scenes in this movie. But one there's a powerful scene about the power of minds, and so for those who are not familiar with it, in this scene, Kevin Costner, who is Roy, he's been a struggling golf pro most of his life. He finally gets to go to the big show. He's at the U.S. Open. It's opening day. He's at the driving range, and he cannot hit a straight shot to save his life.
Yeah, and since this came out when Robin and I were childhood friends, I had to go back and watch it just to remember some of to refresh myself, we'll say that. And after hitting some balls anywhere but straight, Roy said his swing feels like an unfolding lawn chair. He desperately wanted help from his caddy Romeo, which is Cheech Marin. And he started by telling Roy to put all his change in his left pocket.
Yeah, and it just keeps going on where he's asking to do these things like tie your left shoe with a double knot, put your hat on backwards, and then at one point Romeo even puts a T behind Roy's left ear. So Roy gets up there and he just crushes this shot, and he looks back at Romeo and like, how did I do that? And Romeo basically says, you were thinking too much and your brain was getting in the way.
Yep. It's a classic sports psychology scene. And Robin, in many ways, is the Romeo for businesses. Robin examines your business, finds creative ways to improve it. Of course, I don't think Robin's ever told a client their brain was getting in the way. But if that's a little too simple or too simplistic, here's a little bit of Robin's actual background. And since our childhood and our education tracked each other, it's really easy for me to remember. He went to UT undergrad at the same time as me, Hookham. He went to SMU Law School, and then he practiced law for several years early in his career. Fun footnote, I was actually Robin's replacement at my second job when he went on to do bigger and better things. And then Robin went into the business world and was involved kind of as a COO in a few tech industry startups. And Robin found his passion and calling when he started his own consulting business to serve as a chief advisor and strategist for business leaders. And then one kind of final fun footnote is that Robin co-authored a book titled Performance Intelligence at Work, The 5 Essentials to Achieving the Mind of a Champion. Welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, guys. Happy to be here. I love that in your setup, I'm the Cheech Marin of the group here. So, but that clip is such a classic one because Roy, who ends up hitting the ball after all of these crazy things that his caddy makes him do, he hits an amazing shot. And he was like, how did I do that? And his thinking partner, his caddy, says, you weren't thinking, you just hit the ball. And so much of what we need to do is just hit the ball. We just need to play to win. So thanks for having me today.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, Robin, our theme for this season is thinking outside the box. And you have a really cool story, as Michael was kind of introducing you, but you have different career paths before you're at your current company. But let's start talking about the career stops and influences that led you to shift to where you are now. But I think our audience deserves this confession that they need to hear. And today's confession is, you are a lawyer.
I am. I like to think of myself as a recovering attorney. It's actually a 12-step process, which first step is admitting that you have a problem, and there's no way I'm going to be able to do that because in law school they teach you to be right even when you're not right. So we'll go with the fact that true confessions here on the podcast, but it has been a joy for me to actually know the law because it has, with those 5 years of practicing, really established such a solid foundation for the business career that I had, and also now with my clients in the executive coaching practice that I have.
And I'll say, as someone who took over a position you previously had, you left a imprint at our old firm together. One of our, who's now a partner at this firm, I mean, he quoted you often, but one of the things that he often quoted when we were doing litigation work was he would use the term law in the raw, which was the Robin Pou expression for having to wing it on the fly.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was one of the very first associates at that firm. It was a collection of partners and lateral attorneys at the time. And so I was the young buck that it seemed like everything just rolled downhill. And I was sitting in the ravine at the bottom of that hill. And so it was messy. There were just so many cases that we were working on. And it seemed very raw, partly because I didn't know exactly what I was doing. And then just the dynamic nature of that many cases. So I'm surprised that phrase stuck, but it was true.
And you paved the way to make it slightly less raw when I got there, but I do relate with so much of what you just said.
Yeah.
So after half a dozen years or so as a lawyer, you decided to go into business. Kind of talk about that.
Yeah, it was interesting. I practiced law for 3 years in Dallas at a firm that my dad had started back in the 70s. And so it was never my vision or dream to actually work at his firm, but it was a real neat opportunity to be with him in that group of originally 15 attorneys. After I got married, my wife actually got into business school, and that pulled us from Dallas to the Silicon Valley in California. So I took the California bar, Texas bar for me, California bar for her. So I was like, those are the only two states that we could ever live in because I'm not going to take another bar. And I was exposed to the dawn of the internet at that moment in time. It was a real fortuitous opportunity to be there. And it reawakened in me an entrepreneurial spirit that I had had growing up. And so I started setting my sights on doing something different than practicing law.
Yeah. So when I first met you, you were a client of the firm, and by the time we started to get to know each other, you had already been started running several other businesses. But I think kind of fast forwarding just a little bit, why don't you tell the audience, what is a chief advisor and strategist? What do they do?
Yeah, so after practicing law for 5 years and then being in the business world, owner-operator of 4 different businesses over about 11 years, I ran into a woman who is a PhD sports psychologist. She actually trained under Bob Rotella, who is routinely thought of as the founder of sports psychology. And it was through that connection and me working with her that I was exposed to the concept of executive coaching. She was bringing the principles of sports psychology to the business world as an executive performance model. And so when McGraw-Hill published our book that you mentioned earlier, I said, you know what? This is what I want to do. So I hung out my shingle as an executive coach. And over the past 12 years, that has evolved into the title that you just mentioned, Chief Advisor and Strategist. Well, what the heck is that? My clients rely on me not only for executive coaching, which is usually a one-on-one performance coaching engagement. They also invite me deeper into their organization to work with their executive teams, their boards of directors, as well as some of their high potentials. And so we're doing strategic visioning and strategic planning. And so that's why the made-up title is slightly broader than just the executive coaching.
Awesome. Well, as someone who's known you since 4th grade in Mrs. Wheeler's class, I've gotten to see and be alongside a lot. Now, I think, have a handshake non-disclosure agreement for the years leading up to our professional lives. I don't know if Brad needs to tell the audience what a non-disclosure agreement is.
I don't know if that's going to be our word today, but if you really want to know, that means they can't say anything about anyone else. It's like the nuclear option on each other.
Or disclose the pictures. So
Thankfully, there was not iPhones back then. But I got to see firsthand you as a lawyer, and you were an excellent lawyer. I got the privilege of being your lawyer when you went into the business world and got to see you firsthand on the business side as an owner operator and had many successes. The thing that's been fascinating is I saw your passion come out when you made this move. And so kind of talk about why did this click for you as kind of your thing, your calling?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've thought through this, and if you look at my experience professionally up to the point that I started this firm, it doesn't exactly make sense, or there's no through line. So I practiced law for 3 years in Dallas, 2 years in Silicon Valley, litigation, M&A, transactional work, and then owner-operator of these 4 different businesses, which were not particularly connected to one another, although there were some common partners. And if at that point you had looked at my resume, it was like, well, what is this guy doing? What is he focused on? And so by happenstance, when I ran into Julie Bell, my co-author for the book, everything that she was talking about relative to sports psychology as a coaching model really resonated with me from a leadership perspective. So for those 11 years in those 4 different businesses, I was primarily the operations guy. So 75 to 80% of the employees reported directly or indirectly to me. Well, as an attorney, they don't teach you how to be a leader. They teach you how to be an advocate for your clients, which is a type of a leader, but not necessarily a leader of individuals in an operating company. So I was winging it, and I just approached it from an intuitive perspective, which was, I understand that you report to me, but I'm trying to lead the organization. And if I don't give you everything that you need in order to be successful, then I won't be successful. So instead of saying to them, hey, do this for me, I would go to them and say, what do you need in order to get done what we've agreed needs to be done for us to fulfill our vision? Some groups call that servant leadership, and it's basically smart and intuitive on my part because you're helping that individual. Well, sports psychology is a coaching model, just like we were talking about Cheech. So as the caddy, he's the coach for Roy in that scene, and it just fit. It just fit perfectly. All of the vocabulary, all of the coaching theology, if you will. And so I felt like I had found my home professionally from an approach perspective. And 12 years ago, executive coaching was not as widely considered as it is now. So it's great that the market has evolved to where I am. But that would be what was the clincher for me as it relates to just the purpose. Like, oh, I've been doing this, but without any guidance. And so I had found that through the coaching model that is sports psychology.
And I think that leads perfectly into where I wanted to go is we started this basically referencing the clip, and you actually brought it in with the sports reference, but it really is about how the power of the mind can actually impact a business leader. And how, that's what you do, and kind of tell people why you dive deeper into that and what you use, what tools you use for that to understand the power of the mind.
Yeah, so sports psychology, and I should say I'm not the PhD sports psychologist, but training under Julie, I feel like I've earned my PhD. So I'll rest on my JD and my business experience and the thousands of hours that I've spent with these business leaders. Sports psychology is a deep science. It is simple at its core. Thoughts lead to actions, actions lead to results. Now, that formula is not new. In fact, sports psychology has co-opted it. It's existed for a long time. What you think, you will do, and therefore those will be the results that you get. And so most coaches, as I was coming up through the ranks, are focused on coaching actions. So if there's a coach inside of an HR department of a corporate entity, a leader, a rising leader will have a challenge with having hard conversations, confronting situations, conflict management. So what they'll do is that leader will be sent to HR to get skilled up in that particular area of development. That's great because now they have the actions that they're supposed to take. But if the underlying thinking is not addressed, that leader will never discharge those skills, will never use those skills to a level of mastery because their thinking is getting in the way. So their mind is getting in the way. So sports psychology, the big promise of that methodology is that when your thoughts and your actions are in alignment, you can get consistent elite performance. That's a pretty big promise. I mean, who doesn't want consistent elite performance? Consistent day to day, week to week, month to month, and then elite meaning the best that you have to offer. And so who's not striving for that? I mean, leaders who want that have got to start with their thinking, not just the actions.
Awesome. Well, so with that kind of backdrop, we've watched you and watched your, even in this kind of version of your story evolve. Talk about, what you're working on right now and just kind of bring us up to date on your current form of your business.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I'm really excited because I've spent these past 12 years really appreciating the challenges that leaders are facing. And I think we're on the precipice of a leadership revolution. And what I mean by that is 80% of the Fortune 500 companies are currently run by a CEO who comes from the baby boomer generation. And the average age of that CEO is about 67. And so that's a little bit older than has been the case historically, but it's due to the fact that the Great Recession has caused those leaders to need to stay longer, either for their own personal benefit or for the organization. So the current leadership training standard is on-the-job experience. 95% of those Fortune 500 companies report that they do not have a formal leadership training model. So they just default to the on-the-job training. Well, if the generation behind the baby boomers are the Gen Xers and behind that the millennials, if they are not in the top spot, they're not getting the on-the-job leadership training. In fact, Gen Xers over the past 5 years have received 1 to 0 promotions inside of their organization. So the Gen X leaders have been stalled. And so I'm coming to you from the perspective of the Fortune 500, but you can extrapolate this to the larger audience. The baby boomers will be out of the workforce in the next 10 years. In 5 years, millennials will represent 75% of the workforce. So you've got people who are getting ready to ascend to the leadership spot who have no leadership training for the spot that they want to hold. This is a problem. So they're going to be in the role with authority, but without the skills. And if they don't have the skills, you can imagine that when they start stepping forward in their leadership authority, they're going to stub their toe. And that's going to cause thinking issues. So you can be 70% confident about something, but that means you're 30% doubtful. And that doubt is kryptonite to a leader. So we've got a very short window of time to be able to address this issue with leadership training, but also the coaching of the leadership thinking for those individuals that have not been in those spots.
Well, as a Gen Xer, I remember the adults when we were young saying that they couldn't believe that we were going to be the future leaders of our country. And I guess we're proving them wrong since we're not getting promotions.
Yeah, exactly.
You're right.
Self-fulfilling prophecy. Remember, though, these were the baby boomers who were the supposed hippies in the 60s. So every generation grows up, and you can't judge a generation by where they are right now. But the project that I'm working on is a new book that right now is the operating title is called Leadership in Doubt. So all successful leaders experience doubt. And sometimes when I say that, people are like, they do? Well, how come they're not talking about it? Exactly. Those leaders, either by social norms inside of their business or leadership norms, they're not talking about their doubt. And yet, as successful individuals, they know that that doubt is holding them back. So they go into a fix-it mode. And so they'll listen to a podcast, they'll read a book, they'll watch a TEDx video. And when that doesn't actually solve the doubt that they're experiencing, they go, uh-oh. And they start thinking a question to themselves, which is, maybe this is the level of doubt that comes with this level of leadership. Or if this is the level of doubt that I have to live with, I might actually opt out. And that's a pretty significant business decision, settle or opt out. What they don't know at this moment in time is that there are 4 distinct types of doubt. This is what I've discovered over the work that I've done over the past decade. And when you know what type of doubt you have, the really good news is that there's a specific solution for each of those types of doubt. So no longer is this concept of leadership doubt a heavy amorphous blanket that just sits over their leadership. It's something that can actually be dealt with in a quantifiable way. And so that's the book that I'm working on that hopefully will come out in Q1, Q2 of next year, perfectly timed for this leadership revolution that is upon us.
Well, I can just say this from my own personal experience. I know that, I guess about 5 years ago, when we had started talking about meeting up with you and figuring out if we could hire you or if we could fit, I remember telling Michael, well, I don't really know. I mean, we're doing really well. Why would we need someone else? And I will tell the audience, and I'm not promoting you in per se, but it has been a phenomenal experience for us, because as much as Michael and I challenge each other, having an outsider looking over our shoulders, constantly challenging us in great ways and making us rethink the way we are looking at stuff has grown us in ways I never thought we would. And it's not like and I think you've said this before, that you're actually saying this is how to practice law, or this is how you run your business. You're asking them, finding out what are their goals, how are they going to get there, and then challenging to make sure that they're on that the course that they want to set. So that's the one thing I love about working with you, and I'm assuming other coaches out there do the same thing.
Yeah, providing outside insight is very valuable. I mean, in our coaching sessions, I'll ask questions and you'll look at me and you go, Robin, nobody in the legal industry does that. And my job is not to be right about the question that I'm asking. It's really to provoke our thinking. And so then that sets off a string of questions and a conversation that leaves you guys thinking about your business differently. And so I always make the joke, I love my job. My clients have to do all the hard work. And so it really is fun, especially with a partnership like the two of you. And I'm not sure why I've ended up having multiple clients who are 2-person partnerships. But it's really fun, that triad of conversation, because you guys get to go and have the conversation after the coaching session. Awesome.
Well, we're so grateful that you're here today. What we'll do is we'll let you go, and then after we'll go to a commercial, and then Brad and I will come back and see if we can take some of this wisdom and have some legal insights for the audience.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
And welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I am your host, ByrdAdatto, still with my co-host, Michael Byrd. And Michael, we just had a great conversation with Robin Pou. He, as we talked about throughout this episode, has been a big influence on our careers in the last for a long time, but because he brings something unique that is that we as lawyers aren't trained on. And I think, Michael, I'd love to hear some of what are your takeaways initially.
Yeah, I mean, we get to see the human element and how that plays a role in what we do every day, and specifically how thinking plays a role. You've heard the term legalistic, and the connotation always is that you're just kind of strictly thinking about whatever the rule is that's in place. And, in the context of being a lawyer, we see that in some people's thinking, and clients and attorneys, where they will look at a contract and it says what it says, and that's that. And what we find, and what Robin kind of helps us see, is that there's so much more to that. There's more than what's in the contract itself. I always use the analogy with clients when we're talking about conflict or even a deal, that it's kind of like the game of poker. Like, you've got your cards. That's what the words of the contract say. But then you've got all these other elements that play a role in it. You have the human element of the person you're going against. And then you know, in reality, some people have more poker chips than others, and that plays a role into it. And so it's really an illustration or an analogy just to let people see that there's a bigger picture than the agreement itself. Now, the cards you have really matter, so I don't want to minimize that. It's just there's more to it, and I just love Robin's perspective on, you know, how our thoughts lead to actions and how we can use that to understand others and understand ourselves.
Yeah, and I think you know I've had given this speech, and maybe some of our audience has heard it before. We call it the Big Five, where we talk about contracts and things that you need to understand in any contract. But one of the elements we often refer to is that, you know, there are certain elements that come into play that are outside the four corners of a contract. And again, for the audience, typically speaking, when a court's trying to enforce something, the court wants to look to the agreement and say, hey, I want to really stick to whatever you guys agreed to inside the contract. But what we often counsel our clients is think bigger than, yes, that's in the four corners of your contract, but let's think about what's outside of that contract. What's that relationship going to be like after you execute it? How will you be successful that's, again, outside of this contract? Who are these people, the human element that you just referenced to? And so, you know, I think you've said this before, you know, it's more than just the ink and the paper. You really need to consider the leadership of the organization, the individuals you work with. And so those are the elements that Robin often talks about. And then obviously as a leader, when you are going through a contract, you need to figure out, you know, what are your doubts, obviously, surrounding the contract itself. So again, these are all elements that aren't always the legal ease, obviously very important to have it done correctly inside the contract. But these are elements that control the legal thinking and the implications and arrangement outside of the actual contract.
Yeah, I mean, you know, clients, you'll see them get so sometimes consumed when they're negotiating a contract by their rights and how's this going to work. And then we just point out to them that, you know, the minute the ink is dry on this, you probably won't ever see that contract again until something goes wrong.
Yes.
It's not like you show up to work and get the contract out and go over what everyone's supposed to be doing.
And that would be a poor way to run your business if every day you had to look at your contract to run it, because that means that you have a lot of mistrust. So don't recommend that either. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. So again, a special shout out and thanks to Robin for joining us. And any other parting parts, Michael?
I don't. It was fun.
Well, thanks again for joining us. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.